All right, we are right at 1 o'clock. So we are going to get started because we have some introductions to do and we want to get right to the main event. Um, First of all, my name is Emily Knight. I'm with the Lundfest Ocean Program. We support marine science to inform ocean and coastal decision making. And the way that we do that is we work on co-design of projects, co-production, and collaborative science to help set results up to inform decisions in a way that best serves communities. So I want to start off today by offering a land acknowledgement for at least where the Lenfest Ocean Program is based in Washington, D.C. From the coast to the deep water and across boundaries and borders, we would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the indigenous peoples that have called these lands and waters home since time immemorial. Washington, D.C. sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans, also documented as the Nacotch Tank, and the neighboring Piscataway and Pamunkey people, some you're going to hear from today. You will be meeting folks throughout this event, but I quickly want to introduce my team at the Lundfest Ocean Program. If Vicki and Kayla can also come on camera quickly. I want to give a shout out to Jason Landrum, who will be giving some remarks. Kayla Ripple, who will be dropping links in the chat, and Vicki Bell, who handles all of our social media and will be handling the recording. This will be recorded and shared broadly. So just so you know who we are. For logistics, all attendees will be muted. With so many, we have to do that to keep the feedback at a minimum. If you want to offer questions for any of the participants, please use the Q&A panel. We will be using the chat to drop resources. I will keep an eye on the chat if you put questions in there, but we try to manage the queue through the Q&A, so I can't guarantee I'll see it. Now, I want to say what brings us together today is an effort that Lundfest has been funding since 2020, the Marine Biodiversity Dialogues, and Kayla is going to drop the project page in the chat. And in part, the result of the Marine Biodiversity Dialogues is the release of the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy, which Kayla will also drop into the chat. Now that we have the strategy, it is imperative that it works first and foremost for communities on the ground. So going forward, our aim is to work as hard as we can to elevate such voices into the national dialogue. And I'll let Jason speak more to that in a moment. But a couple of resources we want to call your attention to. Roll call. First, Jason put to paper what we hope to inspire across all forms of knowledge, science, indigenous wisdom, local expertise, and the management and policy spaces. We hope that you will come away from this inspired to participate. And Kayla will drop the link to that blog in the chat. And our next virtual event will be an answer to this one. On September 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, noon Pacific, we will bring together state and regional level managers from across the country to both respond to what many of the panelists ask for here today, what they are doing in their respective places for their communities, and what they need from the national level. And Kayla will drop the registration link to that event into the chat, and that will also be a public event and recorded. So I will now actually turn it over to Jason to give some introductory remarks and acknowledge some of our friends here who have been involved in writing the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy. Jason?
Thank you so much, Emily, and welcome everybody. I'm Jason Landrum, a Senior Program Officer with the Lundfest Ocean Program, and I'm really happy for all of you to join us today for this wonderful session. I'm not going to take up a lot of our time as we have an amazing lineup of presentations, panelists, and plan discussion. But I did want to highlight a bit about how we got to today's session and the opportunity that currently exists for all of us to help advance knowledge to action for ocean life in America. Our program has been funding projects in the Marine Biodiversity Dialogues portfolio for about 5 years now. When we started this journey, there wasn't much in terms of a national vision or guidance on how or which knowledge holders could coordinate and collaborate with those in position to make decisions. This remains a challenge, but there is hope. Recently, we've seen an emergence of several national scale efforts aimed at centering diverse peoples, perspectives, and knowledge at the heart of ocean and coastal management and decision making, namely initiatives like the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy that Emily just mentioned, also the National Nature Assessment, America the Beautiful, and others. These efforts are tasked with not only providing opportunities and on-ramps for input from many different groups, but also helping to structure holistic community engagement to bring that knowledge and evidence to life in our management processes. Through the Marine Biodiversity Dialogues, we have strived to support projects that align with this goal, to grow, to elevate, and to include knowledge from diverse voices and knowledge systems as a foundation for informing decision-making around the management, protection, and restoration of diverse marine life. But there's much more work to be done, and all of us, panelists and participants alike, can help. As Emily mentioned in my recent blog, I highlighted the opportunity for different community groups to raise our hands together in support of greater evidence for informed action across our shared ocean and coasts. Whether you're a state legislator, a technology expert, an indigenous leader, a federal resource manager, an environmental advocate, a science policy intermediary, an academic, or if you operate in a different capacity, we can all contribute and generate positive impact in our own special way. Given the current opportunity, our hand is raised, and we commit our program to continuing where and what we can do and offer as a program in this special moment. And I humbly challenge others to raise their hand as well, to look inward, to come together, and to move forward as one in support of the intent and the goals of the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy and other emerging initiatives focused on advancing evidence-based management actions for ocean life in the US. With that, I am proud to kick off this panel and turn it to the individuals working at the front lines. Thank you again for joining us today, and I'll pass it to you, Gabrielle and Emmett.
Thanks, Jason and Emily, for the intro. Let's get this set up here. And especially thanks to all of you for joining us. We're really excited to share some of what we're learning about what biodiversity in the ocean means to people and how this might inform the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy. We're especially grateful that we have several of these folks on the call today so that you can hear from the group in their own words. And of course, many thanks to Lenfest Ocean Program, who's really supported this project and helped co-design it with us from the beginning and have also been great partners in getting the message out to a broad audience. So we refer to this project as Marine Biodiversity Dialogues because these conversations are really at the center of our approach to understanding what the diverse species and habitats of the oceans and coasts mean to people. The project, as Jason mentioned, is led by myself from the Smithsonian, Gabrielle Canonico from NOAA, Stephen Cyphers from University of South Alabama, but really the star of the show, if I might say that, is our postdoctoral scholar, Dr. Kelsi Furman, who's done much of the real work and will be moderating the panel discussion today. So we're convening these dialogues because they're central to making important decisions about how we collectively will live sustainably with nature in the ocean going forward. We believe these decisions should be based on the best evidence we have, and that of course requires classical science, but also understanding the knowledge and values of the communities who depend on nature. So, and finally, turning those decisions into reality usually requires cooperation with governments at multiple levels: federal, state, tribal, local, and so on. So at the heart of the project and of today's conversation is a pretty simple question. What does diverse life mean to you? And more specifically, what benefits do you receive from the diverse species and habitats where you live and work? And I want to show that the arrow in this figure is pointing from biodiversity to people. So the question is, what is biodiversity doing for us, so to speak? We talk a lot about what impact we as people are having on biodiversity, but we want to look at those both directions of that. And those will inform the question of, are we managing and protecting biodiversity in the best way that we can? And does this help us make progress on that? So to answer those questions, we've been asking people who live in nature and work with nature, and we started with 3 regional case studies for community engagement. And we have folks from each of those today, I'm happy to say. So we're fortunate to work with some smart and creative social scientists in this project. I've already mentioned Stephen and Kelsi. We also have Stephen Gray of Michigan State University, who designed this software called Mental Modeler that allows us to transform the conversations and interviews we're having with folks into network models that can describe how different individuals understand how the system works and allow us to compare and do experiments, so to speak, with them. So we started this in the Gulf of Mexico in the coast of Alabama last fall. And I'm happy to say that we have Captain Richard Rutland with us today. And if we're lucky, we may get Director Scott Bannon as well. Our second case study was in the Chesapeake Bay this past spring. And we have Tiara Thomas and Philip Plack with us on the panel today. And then finally, our third case study will be Puget Sound. That will be in the fall. Kelsi just returned from a very productive trip there, meeting folks, and we're pleased to have Jodie Toft from the Puget Sound area on the panel with us. So you'll hear from all of these folks in their own words about ocean biodiversity, but I just briefly wanted to mention a couple of takeaways that our team has got from these conversations. One that really kind of stands out is that biodiversity provides freedom of choice for people and users. And what we mean by that is that the different species and habitats, seasonal patterns of life provide a lot of opportunities for fishing, recreation, for quality of life, and so on. Second, we've heard again and again that living nature is really central to the identity of both individuals and communities. And that's part of the sense of place that many of us feel in the places where we live and work. It's very clear that conservation and wise management are more successful when they leverage bottom-up management and community initiative. And we'll hear some examples of that, I think, today. And finally, for those reasons, decision-making really needs to be inclusive of the communities that live and work in these areas and know them well, with a focus on balancing the protection of nature and people's livelihoods. So with that, I would like to turn it over briefly to Gabrielle, who will speak about the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy.
So we're very grateful that this project was among a number of activities that helped build momentum for the development of a National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy, which Emmett and I led, but with a lot of public input and with input from multiple federal agencies. The strategy is available at the QR code on your screen. An essential theme is really that need for a whole of society approach. But building an understanding of what that means and how that will work is going to require listening sessions and a lot of public dialogue, including events like this one. Tracking status and trends in living nature, projecting its future, these are key to maintaining national prosperity and central to issues that touch all of us, like healthy food, resilient coasts, clean air and water, national security, solutions to climate change. So the White House released the strategy in June to really drive science and stewardship action needed to maintain those benefits. But again, we just can't emphasize enough that we only succeed in this if we can engage all of you. Your voices, your ways of knowing, your types of governance towards improving effective and equitable stewardship of life and the benefits that we get from it. Next slide, please. The Dialogues project and the strategy both also dovetail with the ongoing National Nature Assessment, which aims to understand more broadly how the diversity of Americans value and interact with nature on land and sea, and to provide a foundation for a sustainable future. The assessment is looking at how nature might change in the future, what changes might mean for our economy, for our lives. And the assessment is also emphasizing conversations with communities about nature and how it's changing. Next slide, please. So the Marine Biodiversity Dialogues is just one step in informing that whole of society action, what that looks like to sustain nature. And we're really grateful for the partnership with the LenFest team, which is working so hard to forge meaningful connections and to advance this work and these dialogues. Many of you will have ideas about how your communities can best contribute, and we really invite those conversations. At a minimum, we need to establish some routines for active and iterative dialogue across time, across levels of government, with recreational and commercial users, private landowners, frontline communities, and many others. And I would say from Main Street to Wall Street. The stakes are really very high. So we hope this is one step in a long-term dialogue, and just thank you so much for joining and looking forward to the conversation in the next hour.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Emmett and Gabrielle. And I also want to highlight that Amanda Kirkland and Lauren Wenzel from NOAA are here with us as well. And it's great to have federal ears listening to this conversation. But I will turn it over to Kelsi Furman, who will be moderating the panel. And I would like to ask for all of the panelists to come on camera and unmute yourselves, or if you need my help.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Perfect. All right. Well, yeah, thank you, Emily and Jason and Emmett and Gabrielle, for organizing this exciting event and for that great opening. As Emmett said, my name is Kelsi Furman. I am currently a postdoctoral researcher in marine social ecological systems here at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Annapolis, Maryland. And I'm working with Emmett and Gabrielle on the Marine Dialogues project that they just described. And so before I begin, I want to, of course, thank all of our collaborators for this work on this project, including Stephen Cyphers at the University of South Alabama, Stephen Gray at Michigan State, Ariana Sutengreer at USGS, Melissa Kenny at the University of Minnesota, Mandy Karnauskas at NOAA Fisheries, Southeast Fisheries Science Center, and Joey Bernhardt at the University of Guelph. And in particular, I really want to thank Sarah Gibbs, a PhD student at the University of South Alabama, who has really been instrumental in helping us do this work. So as you can see, it takes a village to get this work done. So I appreciate all of the help. And of course, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today and for sharing their time and knowledge with our audience. We're really excited to have you here with us. Each of these panelists have participated in this project either individually or collectively through participation in some of our community workshops in one of our 3 case studies that Emmett mentioned. So we have panelists here with us today from the Northern Gulf of Mexico, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Puget Sound. And we really appreciate, again, all of your contributions to our project previously and for giving your time today. And we really look forward to hearing your perspectives this afternoon. Before I begin, I want to mention in the program, I think we had a 5th panelist, Scott Bannon, the Director of Marine Resources down in Alabama. We believe he had something urgent come up. So unfortunately, I don't think he will be joining us today. But I wanted to say Scott has provided a lot of really valuable information for this project. So we're sad he can't be here and join us, but we know that he's very sorry he can't be with us as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. When you do your introductions, if you could each please tell us a little bit about yourself, including your name, where you're from, what you do for a living, and then why ocean biodiversity is important for you. So I'm going to start with Tiara, and then I'll call on each of you to go.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Tiara Thomas. I am the Education Interpretation Director at the Accokeek Foundation at Piscataway Park. I am a tribal member of the Piscataway Conoy tribe, and I am the current chair of the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs. And this work is important to me because Piscataway, it means where the waters blend. My people are people of the water. So the cultural and life sources that come from our water are very important to our community, within the tribal community, but the larger community as a whole. And so I am dedicated to making sure that we're doing conservation, but also education. As an educator, I feel like that's what I can lend to this, is making sure that we are educating children and adults on having healthy ecosystems.
Great, thank you. I'll turn it over to Philip next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Phil Plack. I'm the founder and the president of Annapolis Oyster Company. It's a new aquaculture operation based on the Severn River in Annapolis, Maryland. I'm originally from the eastern shore of Maryland, in a small town named St. Michael's, if anybody's heard of it. It's a waterman community. It's a tourist town. I bring a lot of those things with me to Annapolis. My family was not in the seafood industry at all, so this was an operation that I learned how to conduct myself. We grow oysters. We sell direct to consumers. We sell in a number of local restaurants around the Annapolis area. We have a number of distribution partners to have a broader reach up and down the eastern seaboard with our product. In terms of what biodiversity means for me, first and foremost for the business, providing a nutritious and a sustainable diet for individuals is hugely important, and one of the main drivers of why we got into this business, to produce a sustainable product, not be resource harvesters necessarily, but control our own destiny in regards to having a sustainable, high quality, sustainable product that we are proud of to serve and sell throughout the local community. From a personal perspective, I'm a lifelong fisherman. I grew up fishing for all different kinds of fish in the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. And in terms of, my mental health, my little respite from the day-to-day grind, I still thoroughly like to fish. And from a biodiversity perspective on that front, having all kinds of different species to target from a sport fishing perspective, again, not a harvesting perspective, but just from a fun catch and release, billfish in the ocean to bottom feeders in the Chesapeake Bay, like perch. I like having that diversity of things to target at different times of the year, using different fishing methods, and that brings me just a lot of peace of mind, and keep me sane in times of craziness. That's it for me for this question.
Great, thanks, Phil. Richard, turn it over to you.
Hey, I'm Richard Rutland. I'm the owner operator of Cold Blooded Fishing in Mobile, Alabama. I'm a full-time fishing guide. Been doing this for 15 years in the waters of Mobile Bay in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Why is biodiversity important to me? Kind of like Philip was just saying, I depend on the resource to make a living for my family. And I kind of look at it as a big picture. Everything works together symbiotically, to make the whole thing happen. So I start thinking about, are we taking good care of our seagrass beds, our oyster farm, not our farms, like natural oyster beds, reefs, things of that nature. And then you start to the next place I go to is our management. We're talking about Director of Marine Sources for Alabama, Scott Bannon, has done a absolute just wonderful job at managing our resource here with offshore species, inshore species. Anybody in the state can pick up the phone and call that man and ask him a question, and he will listen to you and he will give you an answer. And I think that they do a really great job for the resource. And then I also think a lot of the angler outreach things we do in our community kind of gives everybody as a whole a reason to take care of the resource.
Great. Thank you, Richard. And Jodie.
Hi, it's so great to be here. It's great to hear stories from other parts of the country where you guys are, you're after lunch. I'm not even bumping up on lunch yet over here in the Seattle area. So who am I? So I'm Jodie Toft. I'm the executive director of a small nonprofit called Puget Sound Restoration Fund. And we are not a fund. We're not a fund. We are people who have muddy boots and wet wetsuits, and we do a lot of work throughout what we call the Salish Sea, which is our inland water body here in Puget Sound and San Juan Islands in this region. A lot of work in the water and on the tide flats to restore native species. And so we work really hard on bringing back our native oyster, the Olympia oyster, do a lot of in-water testing, research and development to bring back depleted populations of bull kelp. So those are big forest building kelp. Work on this absolutely beautiful marine snail called a pinto abalone, and a whole host of other things. So if it doesn't have a backbone and it's important in the marine environment, chances are we're pretty interested in it. And if it's been depleted, chances are we are pretty interested in working on trying to recover that species. It's fun to hear Noah come up frequently because I'm sitting out at our conservation hatchery that we operate at NOAA's Manchester Research Station, just a little ways away from Seattle. Lots to talk about here today. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So in terms of, why biodiversity matters, personally and professionally, to me, I think it kind of come at it from a couple different angles. As a trained scientist who spent a lot of time thinking about social ecological systems, really biodiversity is kind of the fabric upon which everything else sits. It's the tablecloth, and then when we have biodiversity, oftentimes we have our food systems that lay on top of it. So it can kind of come at the biodiversity from that more academic angle. But I hear it from the other folks on this call. Biodiversity is sort of what makes me happy, right? So a lot of people who enjoy being in and around saltwater enjoy some of the magic that you get from being in and around saltwater. And a lot of that is because of the biodiversity that exists in the marine system. Just simply put, you might like a nudibranch, you might like a big killer whale, you might like fishing, you might like walking on the beach, but all of those things come together because we have this really well-knit fabric that is biodiversity. And then just sort of on a personal level, which again kind of goes back to the magic that biodiversity creates. It's not just biodiversity, it's just diversity in general, right? Like I'm more of a free jazz person than I am maybe like a John Philip Sousa marching band type of person. I just like things to be wiggling around and a little weird. And diversity gives us that. It lets you stretch your mind in different ways. It helps you kind of get out of your normal space. It reminds you that you're small in a big world. And so when I think of biodiversity, I tend to kind of take the bio out of it and recenter around diversity, because I think that probably is kind of central to my human condition, and I certainly know I'm not alone.
Great. Thank you, Jodie, and thank you everyone for those great introductions. That was great. So as we just heard in your answers, we know ocean biodiversity really provides critical services for coastal communities. Just from hearing your answers just now, we heard about the cultural significance of biodiversity, the importance for livelihoods, for nutritious, and sustainable diet, mental health. And we really also just heard, Richard and Jodie, you mentioned the importance of considering the full ecosystem, the importance of habitat and species interactions. But one thing that's really become clear throughout this project is that there are many different ideas about how to sustain that biodiversity that you all just discussed and that your communities value and rely on. And through our community meetings and workshops that I've mentioned, that Emmett mentioned, we've consistently heard about the challenges that this can cause for coordination of resource management and stewardship. And so next, we would love to hear from you all. What approaches do you think are needed to ensure balance between biodiversity access and conservation? And so if it's okay, I think I'm going to start again and do the same order and start with Tiara.
Thanks so much. I think that one of the biggest issues that we see is understanding the community. For me, again, I have the ability at the Accokeek Foundation to work with federal and state partners that allow me to be in the conversations and to have the conversations. But that may not be the same for some of the other community members who are living on our freshwater marshes or in our wetlands that are feeding into our bay, that are feeding into the ocean. And so one of the biggest things that I think about a lot when we're talking about ocean diversity is also the tributaries. It is the things that are flowing into that. And for me, those access points, I'm on the Potomac River. Literally right now, I'm sitting across from the Potomac River as I'm sitting outside talking to you guys and thinking about how that feeds into the bay and then how that feeds into the Atlantic Ocean. And for my Eastern Shore tribes being here in Maryland, on one side of them is the bay, on the other side is the ocean. And so they have to care for both. They have to be responsible for being able to look at how that affects tribal communities and the culture that brings, being as though they're literally in between the bay and the ocean. For us as Piscataway, being on the Patuxent and the Potomac rivers, thinking about the traditions of things like our shad migration, our American eel migration, and how do we restore those populations, right? At one point, the shad was spawning here, was coming right here to where I'm sitting to spawn, and we've seen a decimation of that. And it's because there was no understanding of what the cultural connection to the shad fish was. There are creation stories that include the shad for the Piscataway people. So where some may see it as, oh, it's just a fish, it's significantly more than that. And so being able to work with people like NOAA and our Mallows Bay partners at the National Marine Sanctuary has allowed us to expand that conversation. But we're just one small organization. We have 14 people working here, right? How do we expand that conversation? How do we continue? And I think that's a lot of the work that you guys are doing and going into community to ask those questions.
Great, amazing. Thank you, Tiara. Phil, I'll go to you next.
Right. I'll pick up on a little bit of one of the points Tiara made. With the shad example, and I think just generally I might take a little bit different tack on this question, and just offer up this thought of, if you're a resource manager, if you're a conservationist, an advocate, any user or overseer of the resource, this concept of trying to communicate the why of what you're seeking to do. I think generally speaking, there's a little bit of a lack of that from what I see. You might hear, say, a resource manager saying, for the health of this body of water, we need to do X. But just pulling that thread just a little bit more and say, hey, we need to conserve submerged aquatic vegetation for these reasons, or we need to preserve this forage fish for these reasons, because they filter and they provide forage for other species in the bay, and just getting better overall at communicating that why. It's a leadership thing. Many people have probably heard that before from Simon Sinek, about how you lead organizations and individuals. You start with the why. You try to get them connected to the vision of what you want. And so some of that applies here, but just how, I hear a lot of people speak. It's not bad, but I think a lot of folks would be better served by understanding just a touch more about why you want to do something, to protect something, or to, perhaps, or just make changes to something that somebody knows, right? The shad example that Tiara said is an example of that. And just another thought too that probably doesn't get said enough, but Richard touched on this, access to those key people. All right, he mentioned a resource director taking calls from anybody. I think that's a super important aspect of how we collectively, get better at what we're seeking to do. I think, generally speaking, people need to try to be a little bit more accessible. I know schedules are crazy, especially, and people are busy. But just the accessibility factor, I think, could be improved. And the last kind of point I'll make is really striving for plain language. Press releases, public speeches, things of that nature. Sometimes they can take on, a little bit of an academic tone, or they can take on a really bureaucratic tone. But just keeping in mind, like we want to communicate the why, just trying to use really, really plain language to communicate what we're trying to do, and build buy-in across all the stakeholders that way. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Phil. Richard?
So I kind of was taking a few notes here, listening to everybody. One thing I kind of think about, like going back to how biodiversity is important to me, and taking care of I guess what I consider the ground, like the ecosystem as a whole, right? Like that's your base to let everything live. And I think about Mobile Bay. We have a lot of issues for a long time, for going back hundreds of years to when this place was settled, of not controlling what goes in the water. You have like at the state and city level, I guess, both sides of Mobile Bay, we don't do a very good job of controlling what goes in the water, whether it's runoff, whether it's sewage overflows, things that are industrial. There's a lot of industry and shipping industry, industrial and shipping industry up at the head of Mobile Bay. I don't think they do a very good job there. And then as it resorts to the management side of it, the things that I like to see when we start talking about like fisheries management, just in my world, talking about limits, size limits, creel limits, all that kind of stuff. Always like when like to see when science backs up what the decision is being made. I've fortunately have gotten to work alongside the University of South Alabama and Dr. Sean Powers. He does a lot of the stock assessments for different species, inshore and offshore, for the Gulf Coast, and the state always takes that data that he gives it, because it's really good data, and then makes a good decision about how to manage whichever species they're looking at managing. And so what I hate to see is fishermen or people who take from the resource just fussing about something and then someone making the decision as a result. I'd like to see science, like a good stock assessment done by a third party or something of that nature, because we've seen some really bad stock assessments happen in the northern Gulf Coast, and bad decisions be made where we're almost completely cut off from our resource.
Great, thanks, Richard. And Jodie?
I feel so lucky that I get to go last here. Tiara, thank you for going first on all of these questions. I mean, it sort of does leave me in a place where, well, I got to say something new. What else didn't these people who are in it every day say? But that's no problem here, because Puget sounds, we're all living in our own spaces. So there's a couple of things that certainly come to mind, and these have been brought up by other panelists in different ways, I'd say. I mean, Richard, it's great to know that maybe top of your Christmas list is a stock assessment, right? That's the best thing you could get, because I think that, one of the things that I think is really needed to try to make progress on, be it biodiversity conservation or restoration, or however we want to think of what we're trying to do in this shared space, is really what systems of knowledge are we using to make informed decisions, right? So one, we should be using systems of knowledge to make informed decisions, right? That's traditional science would have us live in that space. So we don't have stock assessments for certain species, trying to figure out, well, how would we move in that direction? And that's work that we're pretty actively engaged in here in Washington for Dungeness crab, which is a really important fishery in our region. But systems of knowledge come in a lot of different, come in different flavors. And that's where I really think, continuing to push ourselves to figure out, how do you bring in elder stories? How do you bring in community science? What does that look like when you're confronting a traditional stock assessment with these different systems of knowledge? And how can you weave those together? Because you can. And it's a matter of kind of moving past the cultural norm of traditional sciences being the strongest underpinning of our decision making, and finding ways to bring in these other systems of knowledge. And I see a lot of progress on that front, and that is deeply heartening. At least in Puget Sound, one of the big steps that I think we've taken forward recently is figuring out how we'll track and monitor and our floating kelp canopy. And in doing that, and setting that up, the big we here deliberately worked with different tribal communities to bring in elder observations of where that floating kelp had been historically, as a way to have a different type of baseline or validation of baseline that was kind of pulled together from other more traditional monitoring methods that have been used. So that's heartening, and I would push all of us to continue to find ways to bring in those different systems of knowledge, because I do think it makes for more robust decision making, and it sure does bring everybody together in a way that's actually really critical for moving the dial on anything in the marine environment, because that water likes to move everywhere, right? And you can't really buy it and own it. So it just fundamentally is a different world in which you make decisions in, if you're working in saltwater or in these linked aquatic systems like yours, Tiara. I have a few more here. I think another big thing is history and context. So one resource that's out there that we like to point people towards is a online training, not too flashy, that the Nature Conservancy put out a year and a half ago, called Indian Country 101. And if you're going to do work in the marine environment in Washington State, in particular, it's really fundamental to understand what the word bolt means, what the name bolt means, and what the name Graffiti means, because those are two landmark decisions that have really guided the way in which co-management plays out for resources, fisheries, and shell fisheries in Washington. So coming into, not even if you've been working in marine resource management, restoration, or conservation for a long time, there's still more context that you can learn, be it very place-based or regional. And in my neck of the woods, a lot of that context and history does go back to understanding how the tribes in this region differ from one another, and how their systems as rights holders affect the way in which decisions are made at small, medium, and large scales here in Washington State. So those are two things I'll hit on. I have more on my list, but I'll go ahead and stop with those two.
Great. Thank you, Jodie, and thank you, everyone. So we have about 7 minutes left before we're going to open it up to Q&A. So I want to end with one final question and get some further thoughts on your answers that you all just gave to that second question. I think, Jodie, I really like the way you just framed that we need to think about systems of knowledge that we're using to inform decisions, in your response to Richard and some of the things Tiara and Phil have said. And so for our final question, I'm wondering if you all could expand on your last answer and share what you see as the role of local communities, tribes, states, and other individuals and groups in sustaining marine life for future generations. So maybe actually I'll start with you, Jodie, so you can just follow up your thought on that last question, and then we'll work our way backwards.
So tricky.
Yeah.
All right.
And I'll ask everyone give just a quick 1 minute answer so we can have time for Q&A if possible. Thank you.
I really appreciate that. That's usually a good thing to tell me in particular. I think the role of each of the groups that you just listed is to be in it for the long term. And I know that sounds a little ridiculous, but I think that's really important. I think that the partnerships, right, like the old adage that work moves at the pace of trust, works. that totally works for me. And trust is not something that's built over a coffee or 2 coffees or anything like that. You need to be really in it, trying to understand again, understanding context, understanding history, trying to co-create, practicing being flexible, practicing being creative. So for each one of these groups, I think it's that kind of long-term commitment to partnership that is actually really kind of the most important through line that's needed.
Awesome, thanks. I'll turn it to you, Richard.
When I think about this, I think about maybe like watch groups. We have a couple in Mobile Bay. One particular that has a lot of traction is Mobile Bay Keepers. They've done a great job at keeping themselves funded, doing, they're just in the news, on the radio, doing things, doing outreach problems. We have a huge problem in Mobile Bay right now with a 90 million cubic yard dredging project that they're about to do, where they're just gonna kill a lot of our marine bottom here by dredging. And so they're like at the forefront of it. I think that's something I've seen that's done a really good job. The other thing that came to mind was like your state representatives looking and I guess trying to see where your stance of the people that we're electing is before you go and vote, and to bring awareness to folks. If these are your people right here that are going to do something in the name of conservation, to help biodiversity, help stop some of these dangerous problems we have.
Great, thanks, Richard. Phil?
I think a through line for each of those groups, especially in coastal communities, is kind of a general recognition amongst the populace of the impact of humans, and a general desire to get better in sustaining or improving marine biodiversity. So, just kind of always thinking about how to maintain, improve, and accelerate that recognition, I think generally would be a good thing. I look at the local communities as the eyes and ears in a lot of ways of what's going on. They're seeing daily what's going on. Everybody has a phone, so the extent that folks can document what they're seeing, ideas to be improved or to be corrected, and communicate those things to appropriate parties, I think is hugely important, hugely valuable, and impactful. Goes also to advocacy that communities can have, or the brainstorming, the identification of projects that could help do one thing or another to improve diversity and biodiversity in those communities. So yeah, just as general themes, I think those are important. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Phil. All right, and we'll end with Tiara.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed hearing what everybody had to say. Here at the Accokeek Foundation, I am fortunate enough to be in a national park, and to have an executive director who is also a tribal member. So we get a lot of opportunities to bring together our community with our state and local agencies, as well as our federal agencies. We do things like knowledge shares. We're in the schools. We do environmental education programs here. But we're also working on co-stewardship planning. And the co-stewardship planning is bringing together all of those stakeholders. And it really allows for us, and it's not a one-off, right? It's a series. It's the building the trust. It is coming to an understanding of why each people are coming to the table. It's a dialogue and not a discussion, and creating a reciprocal relationship. So it's not me just giving, and that there's nothing in return. And having the leadership that we have here, being able to kind of be that bridge between the tribal community and the federal partners has been really, really helpful in that. because it's somebody in the tribal community that understands the federal systems that we have to work within. And so I've got to see over, especially the last 2 years, really coming out of COVID and saying, we want to go to citizen science. We want to do bio blitzes. We're working with the Nature Conservancy. We're working with NOAA. So it's really all of the players coming to the table and saying, we actually have the same goal. We just have a different idea of how we want to reach it. But can we figure out a way that there's a compromise on how we reach it? So I think that everybody that you named has a role in that, from the local community members all the way to the federal government.
Well, that was a great ending to our panel session, and we were exactly on time at 1:50. So thank you everyone so much for those answers, and I'll turn it over to Emily for the Q&A session.
Thank you all so much. And if folks want to come back on camera as well, Gabrielle, Emmett, really anyone who wants to pop in and answer some of the questions. We have a couple in the Q&A. And before I jump right to that, I do want to acknowledge all the introductions in the chat. I've been reading through, and we have folks from California, Oregon, Washington State, the Great Lakes, Florida, New England, Maryland, of course. And so we have folks from all over. We have some Chamorros in there from Guam who are based in DC now. So it's great to see people from all sorts of walks of life, whether it's academia or managers or industry or indigenous knowledge holders and all of that. So thank you for putting that in the chat. And we're really excited to hear what your questions are. And so the question we have a question from David Dow, which I think is a really interesting question. His question is, how do we get coordinated help from state, federal, science, and regulatory agencies to resolve multiple environmental stressors? And he uses an example from his perspective. He lives in Wacoit Bay watershed in Cape Cod, where biodiversity is affected by climate change, nutrient pollution, toxic chemicals, and overfishing. You know, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe is using rights of nature approach to restore river herring in 3 upper Cape Cod watersheds. But his question is a lot about, which I think is a challenge anywhere, which is that level of coordination that's needed to address especially multiple stressor situations. And so I want to open it up to anyone who wants to answer that.
I would say that's what used to be called the $64,000 question. It's probably worth a lot more now. But that one about coordination is really at the center of so many of the challenges that we face. And you know, the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy, that's basically the very first point that's made in the recommendations. Now, how to do that is a different matter. You know, it's a challenge, obviously, because agencies are siloed even within the federal government, for example, much less with states and localities and tribes and so on. But I guess I would say the first thing is talking to each other, you know, as we're doing here, and bringing the different parties together to find out where the common ground is. And you know, I think ultimately there are opportunities to be more cost effective for the same, you know, to reach the same objective, you know, if groups work together. So first thought about that.
I'll chime in really quickly. What I would say from experience here in Puget Sound is start really small, kind of building on what Emma was saying, but I'd start really small, and I'd start with trying to take an action and try that on for size. So moving out of a hypothetical and thinking, all right, if we're going to fix this one area, what are the different things we might want to do? And then let's game it out and figure out, could we actually do this one thing? Because that really kind of will test everybody. That will kind of make everybody really figure out, well, where do they sit with actually doing something in water or on land that would affect water? And if that's not the right thing to do, then you need to back off from it. But look at something tangible and try to make something small and tangible happen as a starting point, and then be willing to be flexible so that you can find compromise.
Richard, do you have something to say? You're on mute. I think Richard, then Tiara.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. One thing I would say in regards to like it's completely different from how Emmett would go about it with his response. I'm really good at making noise and getting in front of the right people when we've had an issue like this. I used to be really scared of a TV camera, and now I will push you out of the way to get in front of one to say what you got to say, to creative awareness, to create some excitement. You've got to start small, I guess, and get a following. And then once you start to climb the ladder on up to the state and federal levels, you have to be very, very, very organized about your approach with that. I'm not the organized guy. I'm the loud attention getter kind of person. And then that guy was kind of talking earlier. I'm just going to use Mobile Baykeeper down here in Mobile Bay as an example. They are good at the organizing side of things when we've had issues like this, to kind of bring everybody together so that you can start having some good conversations with the right people. It's in my world, it's not what you know, it's who you know, more so than anything. So you have to play that side of it.
So Richard, are you finished? So I'll jump in.
Oh, I am. I'm sorry.
No. So I think for me, this is an interesting question. Sometimes my roles compete I am the chair of the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs. So my responsibilities under the Governor's Office of Community Initiatives is sometimes to be that liaison spot between state government and tribal communities and the commissioners that represent those communities. And so I kind of look at it from that angle of coming to the table and knowing your ask. We all have a complaint, but when you get to the table, what is the ask? So that you can focus on the ask and not get off track. Because the one thing about government, and especially with legislators, turnover is going to happen. And they're not in those places forever. So it's like, as soon as you start getting traction, there's a new person. You got to get them back caught up. So if you have small attainable goals with a specific ask, you may have a better chance of really solving an individual issue. And then from that, you're creating a network. And that network will allow you to have collaborators that come back together, that have a focus and can expand from there. I think that it's also, for me, I am 45 minutes from downtown DC. So I don't mind going to knock on doors. I don't mind going to the Capitol and say, hey, can we get a meeting? Can we talk to the staffers? Can we figure out how we can move this thing along? And I know that that's not always as easy, but you can do that at your local community levels too.
Thank you so much. And we do have one last question here in the Q&A, and we'll end on that. So, because we're right up against 2 o'clock. Eva asks, and I think this is a great question. I have the privilege of working with coastal communities in Oregon to coordinate the development of area-based site management plans for rocky habitat protected areas that were designated last year. Does the panel have recommendations of community marine management plans or co-stewardship plans that I could review to help inform this project? And I actually want to expand this question a little bit and just see if the panel has recommendations for how to work with communities on shared spaces in ways that best use those community members' time. I think that's always a challenge too. As well as if you have any specific plans like Eva is asking that you might want to share as templates that she could look at.
I can
start.
Yeah, I can jump in and say we currently have funding. We're working through this process now to put together our co-stewardship plan. We've had some meetings where we've been able to bring in, the Accokeek Foundation is directly across the river from Mount Vernon. The foundation and the park were created to preserve the view from Mount Vernon. So we have what we call viewshed stakeholder meetings, where we're bringing out the local community, we're bringing out Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So we've been working through some of our funding efforts to put together this co-stewardship plan that includes the tribal community, that includes the National Park Service, that includes NOAA, because we kept saying, we want to do this thing, we want to do this thing, we want to do this thing, we want to do SAV surveys, we want to know all of the invasive management that can be done on site, right? So we want to do all of these plans, but in order to really do that, we have to have that input. So we had to take a step back, and instead of going at green, we're going at yellow, and we're creating the plan. So I hope that that is something that we'll be able to share out, that we're once that report is done and we've been able to complete that project. But I also think that it's something that's ongoing, because the players always change. The game's the same, but the players always change. So I don't think that there's ever a final to that.
Emily, you're muted.
Oh my God, after years. Anyway, we're right at 2 o'clock. Thank you, Jodie. Jodie shared some links with Eva in the Q&A. And I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our attendees for joining us today. And I want to end by saying, we had a comment that this needed to be longer, that we were just getting warmed up. And so we're going to find ways to convene more of these dialogues and bring more people into it in a way that uses people's time efficiently and is respectful of people's time. So thank you all so much for joining today, and more to come. All right, everybody, have a good day.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.